Strauss and Howe, in their book The Fourth Turning, make the case that all of human history can be told through this supercycle of the seculum. They go on to identify the roles each generation plays within the overall seculum. The authors define each 22-year generational shift as a turning. Their book, taking its cue from the wisdom of the Etruscans, highlights that the turning after every fourth generation creates a crisis which plays a pivotal role in the new direction of the culture. These fourth turnings spawn changes to the entire collective mindset. These shifts in mindset happen roughly every 90 years and hold the key to discovering the link between the seasons of human history and the seasons of human life. Unfortunately, these fourth turnings often end in war. Within each supercycle exists consistent generational traits. Every other generation is a population boom generation. The generations in between are considered lost generations with smaller populations. The last 90-year seculum has followed this rhythm. The baby boomers were the largest population the world had ever witnessed. Roughly 82 million people were born between 1946 and 1961. The boomers were followed by Generation X, a lost generation with a population size of only 41 million. Millennials followed Gen X and were born between 1982 and 2004 with a population size of 95 million that outnumbers the baby boomers. Interestingly, throughout each supercycle, there are two pivotal moments that shift the social mindset. The first occurs at the beginning of the supercycle. This is referring to as a turning. The second pivotal moment happens midway through the cycle, 45 years later, and is called an awakening. These shifts change the social direction and collective viewpoint. They occur when the two boom generations are in opposition to one another. As these opposing boom populations bump heads, it creates a period of angst and crisis as the agendas of the old guard and the new young adults are at odds with one another. This opposition forges a crisis that takes several years to play out. As the social mindset of the younger generation pushes back against the traditions and antiquated mindset of the older boom generation, a new agenda is adopted in favor of the old. The friction can only be resolved when the younger boom generation's power inevitably overcomes their older grandfathers. Once the crisis has been resolved, the fresh mindset swings for another 45 years in the other direction, and until the opposing forces and ideas of the next boom generation hit their peak and then face off once again as the cycle continues. This ebb and flow has happened consistently throughout world history and is meaningful when looking at trends in the supercycle. This supercycle is 4 generations in length and adds up to roughly 90 years. The United States has followed this path and come full circle over the last 90 years and is right back where we began. In the early 1930s, with the world facing a debt crisis and the US dollar too strong, a massive mindset change was necessary to bring a new system. Change often comes with pain. The pain of the Great Depression lasted more than a decade and was only structurally fixed until after World War II and a reset of the monetary system. That reset began a new circle that has now been completed. The crisis of the 1930s watched the GI generation face off against the New Worlders, who were born 40 years prior, from 1860 to 1880. The New Worlders mindset was buoyed by the boom times and the massive growth in America in the early 1900s. They mostly escaped the tragedy of the First World War and instead grew up alongside a booming, newly powerful America. Their collective mindset was one of opportunity and growth. Their formative years occurred as our country enjoyed youthful growth. The New Worlders lived their peak earning years through a roaring 20s that boomed, which fueled much of the mindset. This was a generation of risk takers who believed that growth and boom times were an American birthright. They were individualists and gamblers and explorers who built America. The GI generation, born from 1900 to 1924, had a uniquely opposite experience. Their childhoods were colored by the Great Depression, especially for those at the tail end of the GI generation who became young adults as we entered into World War II. The identifying traits of the GI generation was not the individual. GIs were all about the collective. They shared a collectively endured pain. They cherished teamwork and freedom and the idea of saving more than earned. When called for war, they lined up, eager to serve their country. America was a country they believed in, and they had suffered alongside those whose collective vision was far more a priority than their own individual. The values of the GI generation were instilled into the newly dominant America, who after World War II was the unchallenged king. The silent generation, born during Depression and war, were taught to be frugal. They followed the rules, kept their heads down, worked hard. They were told that children were to be seen and not heard. Their baby boomer children would shatter that model. The 1950s are considered the golden age of America, a time when the priority of values was God, country, family, and self, and in that order. The baby boomers would have a uniquely different perspective. Their experience mirrored the identity of the New Worlders 3 generations prior. Boomers grew up in a dominant, thriving, and growing America. Their lives were more focused on the individual than the collective. They came into young adulthood during the Vietnam War, forced to defend a mindset that wasn't their own. The boomers questioned the values of the collective. Why should I go fight in a war I don't believe in, for a country I don't believe in? Their identification with politics was that of Richard Nixon and corruption, not one of a supreme American value system. They came into young adulthood in the peak of massive inflation. Saving, which was the core value of their GI grandfathers, was replaced with borrow and spend, since these strategies are far more effective in inflationary times. Their investment careers were colored by the combination of a booming generational push together with the stock market that hit bottoms and the newly forming financialization of America. The 401k became the norm. Boomers were the first generation as a group to invest in stocks. Through company-sponsored plans, boomers funneled their money into the stock market. From 1980 to 2000, the stock market increased 14 times. Prior to the boomers, only wealthy executives invested in stocks. Boomers hit their peak earning years as deregulation and lower interest rates became the fuel for financial assets. Today, the boomers are the last generation to still believe in stock investing as the appropriate way to save for the future. The boomers are a me generation, and their experiences coincided with that mindset. Greed is good was a famous line from the movie Wall Street, and a fair summation of the mindset of this generation. Boomers elected politicians who catered to their desires. Balanced budgets were far less a concern for the boomers than the Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid programs that must never be cut, regardless of the amount of debt necessary to fund them. 2 generations later, the millennials, born between 1981 and 1996, have become young adults and are entering into their peak earning years now. They are doing so in decidedly worse conditions than their boomer grandparents. Millennials have witnessed 2 stock market collapses and have come to view debt as a curse rather than a blessing. Like their GI great-grandparents, the millennials are a collective generation that has become known as the sharing generation. They are far more connected socially than their boomer grandparents and identify social experiences and environment as more relevant than how much money they earn. They are a generation that witnessed the advantages of their grandparents and have come to terms with the reality that they will be a generation whose best chances of financial success come from inheritance rather than rising up the ranks of the American dream. This is a generation far more inclined to socialism and collective policies, and why the far left ideas of Bernie Sanders have its deepest roots support from millennials. The overarching lesson is that we are a sum of our experience and perspective. Each generation within the saculum has endured through similar circumstances that align their agenda. Reviewing history through this lens allows us to more easily identify the power shifts that turned as major financial crises reared its head. Momentum swings do not occur in times of prosperity. They are forged through crisis. The GI generation faced off against their New World grandparents in the deflationary 1930s. Boomers faced off against their GI grandparents in the inflationary 1970s. Millennials today find themselves in a similar position to their GI generation as they face off against their boomer grandparents in the deflationary 2020s. These shifts in power and mindset are born out of a crisis that often takes 10 years to play out. The Great Depression was a crisis that witnessed the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. What had been a booming time in America in the decade prior soon saw famine, pain, and despair as prices of goods dropped. Unemployment would rise to their highest levels in American history, hitting as high as 80% in some cities. Depressions are a deflationary crisis. We have a deflationary crisis looming today. In the 1930s, it was the price of goods and services that fell. Today, it's a deflationary crisis in the price of money. The crisis today will lead to the same types of dramatic policy shifts witnessed in the 1930s. Back then, Franklin Delano Roosevelt soothed the depressed citizenry through his fireside chats. He explained his New Deal and sold the United States citizens that a gold recall was necessary. He promoted his massive spending bill and explained his new Social Security program, ideas that would have been considered heresy 5 years earlier. The entire idea of the socialistic New Deal was the opposite of American capitalism and the Roaring Twenties. The New Deal was socialism. It offered public works, financial reforms, and regulations. But it and the GI Bill were passed, and men and women lined up to come together, putting the country over self.